Imagine this. You're on a flight, seated next to someone who seems quiet, maybe even a little out of place for first class. Annoyed, you decide to voice your thoughts, throwing a few insults their way. But what if mid-flight, you found out that person wasn't just anyone? They were one of the most famous and beloved people on the planet. That's exactly what happened to Jason, a man who learned the hard way that appearances can be deceiving. Stay with me because this story takes a turn so shocking, it left the entire plane stunned. It was a crisp morning at JFK Airport. Jason, a sharply dressed businessman with a taste for luxury, strode confidently into the first-class cabin of a Los Angeles-bound flight. To Jason, flying first class was more than just a convenience. It was a symbol of status. As he settled into his plush leather seat, he quickly scanned the other passengers. Across the aisle, a well-dressed couple was chatting quietly. In front of him, a man in a tailored blazer was already working on his laptop. Jason smirked. My kind of crowd, he thought. But when his seatmate arrived, Jason's mood shifted. The man wasn't dressed like the others. Wearing a simple black hoodie, faded jeans, and scuffed sneakers, he carried a well-worn backpack slung over one shoulder. His hair was slightly messy, and his face bore the kind of calm, unbothered expression that Jason found irritating. The man nodded politely as he took the seat next to Jason, pulling out a paperback book from his bag. Jason leaned back, rolling his eyes. First-class standards are really slipping these days, he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. The man didn't respond, flipping open his book and quietly settling in. The flight attendants began their pre-flight routine, but Jason wasn't finished. He glanced at his seatmate's book, a dog-eared novel with a plain cover. Who even reads paperbacks anymore? Jason asked, his tone dripping with condescension. You'd think people flying first class could afford an e-reader. Still, the man remained silent, his calm demeanor only fueling Jason's irritation. To Jason, this guy didn't belong here. He looked too ordinary, too out of place for first class. As the flight took off, Jason's mood didn't improve. He complained about the temperature of the cabin, the delay in takeoff, and even the way the man next to him took up too much space. Meanwhile, the other passengers were beginning to notice. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others buried their faces in magazines, trying to avoid the tension. Despite Jason's pointed comments, the man in the hoodie didn't react. He continued to read his book, his expression serene. But this wasn't just an ordinary passenger, and Jason was about to learn that in the most unforgettable way. The first-class meal service began, and Jason wasted no time criticizing the options. When his neighbor's meal arrived, Jason smirked. "Let me guess," he said. "Vegetarian? Of course. You'd go for something trendy." This time, the man finally looked up, meeting Jason's gaze for the first time. He smiled politely but said nothing, turning his attention back to his book. Jason scoffed. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But while Jason's comments were growing louder, the atmosphere in the cabin was shifting. Passengers and flight attendants alike were starting to notice the man in the hoodie, not because of Jason's rude remarks, but because something about him seemed familiar. As the flight attendant served the man his drink, she hesitated for a moment. Her eyes widened slightly, and she leaned in to whisper something to a colleague. The other attendant glanced at the man, her face registering surprise. Jason didn't notice. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the whispers and glances now spreading through the cabin. A passenger across the aisle leaned over to her companion, whispering something excitedly. Another discreetly pulled out their phone, pretending to scroll while snapping a quick photo. Jason, still unaware of the growing buzz around him, continued his tirade. "You know," he said, "I don't understand why airlines let just anyone into first class these days. It's supposed to be exclusive." At that moment, a woman across the aisle couldn't hold back any longer. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you even know who you're sitting next to?" Jason turned to her, confused. "What are you talking about?" The woman shook her head, almost in disbelief. "That's Keanu Reeves," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone around to hear. The cabin went silent. Jason froze, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What? No, you're joking," he stammered, turning back to look at the man beside him. The man, Keanu Reeves, offered Jason the same polite smile he'd worn all flight long. The whispers grew louder. Passengers were now openly staring, some taking photos, others nudging their neighbors in astonishment. Jason's bravado crumbled in an instant. His face turned pale as the weight of his actions sank in. Jason stuttered an apology, his earlier arrogance replaced with awkwardness. I didn't realize. I didn't mean to." He trailed off, struggling to find the words. Keanu simply nodded, his expression calm and understanding. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Everyone has bad days." The other passengers, however, weren't as forgiving. They exchanged disapproving glances, their sympathy now fully directed toward Keanu. When the flight landed, Jason remained in his seat, too embarrassed to move. Keanu stood, grabbed his bag, and turned to Jason with one final kind smile. "Take care," he said before walking down the aisle and disappearing into the crowd. Jason sat there for a moment, staring at the empty seat beside him. He had spent the entire flight belittling someone who had handled the situation with grace and kindness. As he finally stood to leave, Jason couldn't shake the humiliation and the lesson he had learned. Sometimes, the most unassuming people are the ones who deserve the most respect. If you were Jason, how would you have reacted? Would you have apologized sooner, or acted differently altogether? Let me know in the comments below, and let's discuss how this shocking encounter could have been avoided.